d4, queen, knight f6, knight f3, b6, Indian defense, Tory attack, opening line. This move order to achieve the queen's Indian defense posture has little independent significance. It is only a less flexible method, which means it rules out a lot of options, of playing the queen's Indian defense. With 2e6 instead, you wait longer to declare which formation you will adopt. g3, Indian defense, Tory attack, opening line. Bishop b7, Indian defense, Tory attack, opening line. c4, King's Indian attack, symmetrical variation, transposed, opening line. g6, out of opening book, e6, would have been in the Indian defense, Queen's Indian defense, main line, transposed, book opening. Bishop g2, makes way for a castle to the king's side. Bishop g7, makes way for a castle to the king's side. Castle kingside, frees white's knight at f3 from the pin. Castle kingside. Rook e1, e6. Knight c3. Knight e4. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Black wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. Bishop g5 attacks black's queen and blocks black's pawn at g6. Queen e8 moves it to safety. Queen d2. d6. Bishop h6 pins black's bishop at g7 with a partial pin and blocks black's pawn at h7. Knight d7. Rook a c1. Queen e7. Bishop takes g7. Attacks black's rook at f8. King takes g7. Removes the threat on black's rook at f8. Black wins a bishop for a bishop. Material is even. Bishop h3. Knight f6. Knight h4. Bishop b7. f3. c5. e4. C takes d4. Creates a passed pawn on d4. Queen takes d4. Pins black's knight. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Rook f d8. Knight g2. Moves it off the edge. Queen c7. Knight e3. Queen c5. Attacks white's queen and blocks white's pawn at c4. Queen c3. Moves it to safety. a5. Rook e d1. h5. Rook d3. b5. b3. B takes c4. Threatens white's rook at d3. B takes c4. Removes the threat on white's rook at d3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Bishop c6. Rook c d1. Rook d7. Bishop g2. Rook b8. Seizes the open file. Queen d4. Disengages the pin on white's knight. Queen e5. Frees black's knight from the pin and blocks white's pawn at e4. f4. Threatens black's queen. Queen takes d4. Pins white's knight. Rook takes d4. Frees white's knight from the pin. White wins a queen for a queen. Material is even. Rook c7. Rook 1 d2. Knight e8. Removes the threat on black's pawn at d6. King f2. King f8. c5. D takes c5. Threatens white's rook at d4 and creates a passed pawn on c5. Black wins a pawn. Black is up a pawn in material. Rook c4. Moves it to safety, attacks black's pawn at c5 and blocks black's pawn at c5. Bishop b5. Protects black's pawn at c5 and threatens white's rook at c4. Rook c3. Moves it to safety. c4. Advances the passed pawn. e5. Rook c5. Knight c2. Knight c7. Takes the knight away from the edge of the board. Knight d4. Knight d5. Threatens white's rook at c3. Bishop takes d5. Protects white's rook at c3. Rook takes d5. Partially pins white's knight. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Knight f3. Rook c5. Moves it behind the passed pawn at c4. Rook b2. Pins black's bishop. Rook d8. Frees black's bishop from the pin and seizes the open file. Knight d2. Bishop c6. Knight b3. Attacks black's rook at c5. Rook b8. Pins white's knight. Rook c2. Frees white's knight from the pin. c3. Attacks white's rook at b2 and advances the passed pawn. Rook b1. Moves it to safety. Rook b5. Moves it to safety. Rook takes c3. Attacks black's bishop. White wins a pawn. Material is even. Bishop d5. Moves it to safety. Rook c1. Frees white's knight from the pin. Bishop takes b3. Attacks white's pawn at a2. Rook takes b3. Partially pins black's rook at b5 and protects white's pawn at a2. Rook takes b3. A takes b3. Rook takes b3. Creates a passed pawn on a5. Black wins a rook, a knight, and a pawn for a rook and a bishop. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Rook c8, check. Checks black's king. King e7, moves it out of check. King g2. a4, pushes the passed pawn. King h3. g5. F takes g5, isolates black's pawn at h5. White wins a pawn. Material is even. Rook b4. Rook a8, places it behind the passed pawn at a4. Rook g4, attacks white's pawn at g5 and blocks white's pawn at g3. Rook a7, check, removes the threat on white's pawn at g5 and checks black's king. King f8, moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at g5. g6. F takes g6. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. King g2. g5. King f3. Rook b4. King e3. King e8. King d3. h4. King c3, threatens black's rook. H takes g3, threatens white's pawn at h2 and isolates white's pawn at h2. H takes g3. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Rook g4, moves it to safety, attacks white's pawn at g3 and blocks white's pawn at g3. King d3, slightly better is king d2. a3, advances the passed pawn. King e3. Rook takes g3, check. Protects black's pawn at a3, checks white's king, and creates a passed pawn on g5. Black wins a pawn. Black is up 2 pawns in material. King d4, moves it out of check. g4, pushes the passed pawn. Rook a8, check, checks black's king. King d7, moves it out of check. King c5, slightly better is rook a7, check. Rook d3. King c4, threatens black's rook. Rook f3, moves it to safety. King c5, leads to g3, rook a7, check, king c8, king d6, g2, rook c7, check, king b8, rook g7, rook f2, rook g8, check, king b7, rook g7, check, king b6, rook g3, a2, rook b3, check, king a5, rook a3, check, king b4, king takes e6, king takes a3. Better is rook a7, check, leading to king c8, rook a8, check, king b7, rook d8, g3, rook d2, rook f2, rook d1, g2, king b3, rook f1, rook d7, check, king c6, rook g7, g1, queen, rook takes g1, rook takes g1, king takes a3, which gains a pawn. g3 advances the passed pawn. White resigns.